As always, there's a prayer on your handout on the first page. If you wish, please go pray with me. O God, you made us in your image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infects our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggles and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, so, actually, I wanted to tell you all something first. You probably heard it in the church service this morning, but George Barfield did pass last night, so please keep her and Sarah and the rest of the family in your prayers. So today we're going to talk about the middle on the Sermon on the Mount. If there's a part of the Bible that you all probably already know well, it's here, because here is where we get the Lord's Prayer, right? This is actually where Jesus gives it to us. I'm going to tell you right now, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, because I do have planned in the somewhat near future to do a class like this one just on the Lord's Prayer for a few weeks. So we'll talk about it, but I'm not going to dive in deep. So this is kind of the middle on the Sermon on the Mount. I told you the other day, there's the Beatitudes, that's the beginning. There's a parable, some things Jesus says at the end. And then in the middle, there's these three major parts. We talked about one of them last week where we saw Jesus teaching about things like lust and then love. We have some of the same formatting here of "you've heard it said, but I say," those kinds of things are here, but there is also a bit of a shift. So the way we're going to handle this today is I'm going to kind of go over some general things after we look at the passage, and then we'll dive into each of the sort of three major themes, which are almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. So in Jesus' world, and arguably for ours too, these are your basic religious obligations. So this is one of the shifts between what we did the week before this week. Is last week was kind of about just good deeds in general. Here we're talking about specific things that are expected of you. So if you're going to be a follower of God, right, whether you're a Jew or a Christian, these are the basics. At some level, you're expected to give alms, to give money. We don't like talking about that, but it's what's there. We're expected to pray, and then fasting in some sense. So we'll briefly talk about those things, right? The general principle in this passage, so we're looking at chapter 6, verses 1 through 18. The general principle comes in the first verse, where it says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness," the word there can also be translated justice, "before others, in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven." So basically, don't do stuff to show off. That's not the point, right? We'll come back to that. Then we get the three themes, which are almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. And what's common in all of them is to do these things, but when you do them, don't draw attention to the fact that you're doing them. So if you give money, don't go around telling everybody, "Look how much money I gave." That's not the point. When you pray, don't pray in a way that draws attention to yourself. When you fast, don't look miserable so everybody knows what you're doing, right? Hal.
So you see an awful lot of people's names on things. Would that be a good example?
Well, I think there's something to this of. So the big thing we're going to get into here is what's happening in this passage is Jesus is saying what God cares about is your intentions for doing actions. So we'll come back to this in more detail in a bit, but we can think of the fact that two people can do the same thing. They can give $1 million to a charity. Same act, right? And in one case it can be righteous, and in the other case it could actually be a sin. because of the reasons for which they are doing it. If I'm doing it because I genuinely think I'm supposed to do this to help other people, great. If I'm doing it because I want my name on a building so everybody pats me on the back, that's a different reason, right?
So only God knows which,
right.
which is.
So, but like, I think the tricky thing is let's say we do have someone who does some great deed, gives a bunch of money, and the people they gave it to said, we're going to put your name on a building. Right? The person didn't do it for that reason. So I don't think we can instantly say every time someone's got their name on a building, they're a bad person, right? But there are people who do good deeds for that reason. Right, there's those things like that, right? I mean, yeah.
I was a grant writer, and so I'm thinking of all the foundations that I asked for money, and the money came, and it did great good. Yeah.
So I think this is where we want to be careful that one of the important things this here is there isn't this just very clear black and white on this. In fact, that's part of the point, is Jesus is saying, God knows what's going on in your heart. We don't always know what's going on in other people's hearts. Right? So it is the case that people could do a thing that we think is awful, but maybe they actually had good intentions. Or maybe they're doing something that we think is wonderful, and they don't have good intentions either, right? That's part of the key. But we're being asked here to sort of say, examine your own self. I mean, part of the principle here is stop worrying about what everybody else is doing. Worry about yourself, right? But yeah, so I think that kind of gets to those questions of, I mean, we could even, this might be a touchy thing, but like we go upstairs in our church, on the wall, there's people's names on little plates who have given money, right? Like, why are they doing that? If the purpose for giving it was, I want my name on the wall, well, that's a dumb reason. Right? Right, so, I mean, that thing, but I mean, again, there is also a place to praise people who do good things to a degree, right? Again, the issue is that the reason why they're doing them? I hope not, right? They're doing them because they're really trying to do the right thing or the good thing, right? So
if you doubt yourself, leave it to your kids.
Maybe, right? You know? So,
when they teach the tax code it was going to be that people, well, it is, you may not be able to claim all your charitable gifts.
Yeah.
There's a lot of writing out there, not to say, well, nonprofits are really concerned they're not going to be, their income's going to come down because people aren't going to give because they can't get it off their taxes. Well, that's the only reason you do that.
Right.
Not the right reason.
Well, and
things are not, you probably won't be able to.
Right. Yeah. And again, I think that's part of the reason too, is again, like, people do these great things, but like, why are they doing them? This is part of what this passage is about, right? So if we come back to the actual biblical passage, we can see that there's this pattern here of, right, so there's the three things. The first one is alms. Whenever you give alms, don't sound a trumpet, so don't draw attention to it. I mean, he's kind of saying here, don't toot your own horn, right? As the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that others praise them, rather do it in a secret, right? So there's this the constant pattern. Same thing with prayer, right? When you pray, don't be like the hypocrites who love to stand and pray, right? Rather, do it in a secret, right? So we'll come back and unpack some of these things. Then for prayer in particular, we get an example of how to pray. And there's sort of a negative here of don't heap up empty phrases. So we've all been somewhere where we've heard a person get up and pray, and it's this just long-winded, flowery prayer that goes on and on and on, right? Why would you do that? Possibly because you're drawing attention to yourself and how amazing you are, right? And that's what would be one of the issues. The other issue, I think, here is actually people in Jesus' time who think that this kind of prayer might manipulate God. So I think that actually says the Gentiles, I mean the pagan understanding of the gods is, if we keep talking to them and keep petitioning and keep praising them, they'll change their mind and do what we want. Part of what we're being taught here is this is not how the real God operates. You can't talk him into it. You can't manipulate him into prayer by saying it over and over again, right? Rather have confidence that God wants what's good for you. You don't have to convince him to do good things for you, right?
Or it could be because
Well, the Bible does talk a couple of times about God changing his mind. The tradition has largely come to the conclusion that that's a metaphor, not something to be taken literally, though not everyone agrees, right? Part of the problem would be, what would it look like to change your mind if you're omniscient and omnipotent and all those kinds of things, right?
He doesn't need to change it.
Does he? The issue would be like when you and I change our minds, hopefully it's because we get new information.
Right.
I was wrong before. God doesn't acquire new information. Go ahead.
Or the prayer might be long because the rolls in the oven aren't done.
Right? It's right. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm curious about the Catholic practice of the Rosary. I always think of that when I read this passage, but my understanding is beginning to be enlightened. I don't think they're trying to convince God or get God's attention so much as it's a technique of meditation.
Yeah, a good Catholic is going to tell you that, right? And for one thing, it actually is often a private discipline. You're not praying the rosary in public, though you could go to a service, and that's what you do. Everybody there is praying the rosary. There's a leader up front, people in the pews doing it too. But again, it isn't something they're doing to attract attention. It's the same kind of thing over and over again as you move the bead, right? But yeah, it's repetitive in order to keep your mind focused, right? I don't think that's what's being condemned here, right? This is, if I say over and over again, God, will you just do this? Will you just do that? I hear those kinds of prayers all the time, right? And this is the idea of, we're not going to change God's mind, somehow get him to like us when he didn't before, right?
It's true in other religions like Islam, Buddhism, whatever. They have kind of a basic practice, as this would be, even though I know they don't really use the Bible.
I can't speak to Buddhism intelligently. I just don't know enough about their prayer practices. I know that. Some Buddhists really don't believe there's even a deity. So who would you pray to, right? If anything, Islam has a much stronger sense of God's sort of providence, where everything is, at least some forms of it, everything's determined. In fact, during the Reformation, Catholics also often accused Reformed Christians of being Muslims because of our doctrine of predestination. It was a common, you're just Muslims. You're not really Christians anyway, right? So that would be one way to sort of, again, so your typical Muslim isn't going to think that, again, you can change God's mind, right? What's cool? So those are the three things. So I want to begin by just I have some comments. I given you these on the handouts, and then we'll get deeper into the actual theme. So I want to just sort of frame it all, right? The first thing to point out is this general principle of don't do righteous things in order to get other people to see you doing them, right? Rather do them in private. This is a theme all over the Bible, and I've just given us three further examples. So in Romans, Paul says, "For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is a circumcision something external and physical. Rather, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not the written code. Such a person receives praise not from humans, but from God," right? So even these very important external religious obligations, Paul is saying these are really internal things. You can't do them to show off, right? In the Old, let me do these three passages, then we'll come back. In the Old Testament, we read the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but God looks in the heart. And then one more from Luke. This is the story of the widow's mite, right? Jesus says, this woman is given more than everyone else, even though she's only put 2 small coins in, because she's given everything that she had, whereas others are giving out of their abundance. So they've got extra, and that's what they give, right? So this is kind of a theme of the amount a person gives, the appearance of their external piety and holiness. This isn't the final test, right? God knows what's really going on. And we're being encouraged to sort of think about that for ourselves. Hal, you had a question.
Well, a lot of us were circumcised before we
Right.
or have the ability
Yep.
to reason and to make a choice.
Yep.
So I feel that my circumcision came many
Right.
years later.
Well, and I think, but the other issue here is that, like, the fact that we do that now is for medical reasons. Whereas what's being talked about here is the Jewish practice of, this is how you became part of the Israelite community, right? The equivalent for, equivalent for us would be something like baptism, right? Again, our typical practice as Reformed Christians is we baptize infants. If you become a Christian later in life, we'll baptize you as an adult, right? But our norm is, this is how we do it, because it makes the person part of the community, right? And what I think we could continue Paul's thought of, just because we baptized you as a baby, right, doesn't mean that, like, what's going on aside of you is perfect. Right. Yeah.
And so I think, do we not use confirmation?
Right. We would do those kinds of things. Yeah.
Rebaptism, and where in the Bible does it say you must be baptized in order to gain access to heaven?
It doesn't say that explicitly, but it does say, if you are a faithful follower of Jesus, you will get baptized.
The guy on the cross next to him was a faithful follower.
Because he didn't have time.
Right.
That's okay, right? But this would be the issue of, like, if they'd had the opportunity to get off and go live their lives, that guy should have arranged to be baptized soon, right? That would be the thing, right? So the faithful thing is, yes, your salvation is not contingent on this external act, but if you have the opportunity to do that external act, you don't have any good reasons not to do it, basically, right?
But we tend to keep it in our pants so that other people...
Right. Well, yes, right, for that. But that's getting us into a much more complicated issue, I think, with sort of Israelite history. Yep. So that's just my first point here is, right, we've got these 3 major sections. The emphasis in this one is what I've already kind of alluded to. This, what we might call religious obligations, or we could also say simply the behaviors that distinguishes a Christian. So Christians are supposed to do these kinds of things. We're supposed to give alms, pray, and fast, right? But other people do them too, and in fact, we oftentimes ourselves do them in ways that are hypocritical, and that's what this passage is all about, right? But these things are things that are just basic characteristics of what Christians do, right? It's also about, he alluded to this, it's got a whole bunch of connections with what we talked about last week. So both that passage and this one begin with a focus on righteousness or justice, which isn't being morally perfect. It's being in a proper relationship with God. It doesn't mean that you're perfect, but it means your relationship with God has been restored. So the righteousness is something that God gives to us, not something we conjure up through our holy works, right? In both the passages, Jesus' teaching is being contrasted with a Jewish tradition, and he's making things more radical. So we get this pattern of, you've heard it said, but I say to you. That's in the earlier passage. And then here we get Jesus says, don't do X, Y, or Z. Truly I tell you, do this, right? So don't pray in a way where everybody sees you doing it. Go pray in private, right? The difference is, one of the differences is that prior section seems to be concerned with actions, so doing certain things, whereas here we're getting into the intentions behind the actions, right? Which is probably why they follow on each other. They're connected insofar we've already talked about these good deeds you're supposed to be doing. Now let's talk about what's really going on inside of you, right? So I think, again, I've already begun talking about this, but I think we'll be happy here. This is my example, right? Every single one of us here has at some point experienced a lust. We just have, let's be honest, right? The question is, what do we do with it? I have this feeling, I have this experience, it's happening to me. How do I act on the basis of what that's happening, right? So something like a lust, do I say, I'm going to resist, I'm going to pray, I'm going to ask God to help me, I'm not going to give in to the temptation, or do I give in, right? So you have people who experience the same thing, but on the basis of that experience, they act differently. One person sins, the other person doesn't, right? So we can talk about things that way. On the other hand, we can talk about people doing the same action. So again, I use this example of two people giving to a charity. That's a good thing, right? But what are their reasons for doing it? So people can perform the same moral action. We can say it's a holy thing, it's a good thing that they did, but their reasons for doing it will be completely different, and one person's doing it for a good reason, other person isn't doing it for a good reason, right? So the action itself also doesn't determine if a person is righteous. So, I mean, in a certain sense, we're getting deep here into thinking morally of, it isn't just the action that deserves our attention, it's also our intentions for the action. And this gets complicated, I just want to point that out, right? It's easy, I think, for us to judge other people and try to figure out what they're doing. It really isn't easy, but we think it is, right? But even think of the reasons why we do things. So think of some good thing or even a bad thing that you've done recently. And if I had to put you on in the courtroom and ask you, why did you do this, right? I think you'd actually have a bunch of mixed reasons. Some of them would be good and some of them wouldn't be so good, right? Because we do good things in part because, yes, this is the right thing to do. It's also because I want people to think well of me, right? And those things can simultaneously exist in us. And Jesus is asking us here to really examine our own intentions, right? And to kind of constantly be doing that, right?
Politicians
right. Well, and again, I mean, I'm with you on that. I think they need to think about this because, again, I'll just be honest. I'm inclined to look at most politicians and say the reasons why you're doing what you're doing is because you want power.
Yes.
Right. So, but I think we ought to actually pause and ask: is that the case for all of them? Right? We don't know. We don't know what's going on in their hearts.
I'm still thinking back on foundations that give money. And give a great deal of money to many, many good causes. And sometimes their reason for doing would be for tax purposes.
Yeah.
But if what they do results in good, how do we look at that?
Right.
I'm just thinking, one of the things that I wrote grants for that just spoke to my heart was our children's matinee program. And the kids that would never have ever gotten to see Shakespeare got to come and learn and read and all the good things that can do. So it resulted in amazing things, but it was still done not out of a sense of doing good, not caring about these kids, caring about their tax returns. It's a blessing.
This is the only one way to answer that question, and was trying to think of the right biblical reference, and I can't come up with it, but it's a pretty frequent biblical theme of why does God give us the law? So why do we have to have rules like don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery? We're actually told over and over again it's because sinners will do these things if they're not told don't do them. Right? So sometimes we need the rule. But then we're also told the righteous don't need the rule. Right? The law is for people who need the encouragement to not do these things, right? So, I mean, there is a place to say, I mean, God is kind of saying, to get everybody to be relatively good, I'm going to give you a rule with a threat behind it, right? This is why we have laws. I mean, if you commit murder, you're going to go to jail, right? But a good person doesn't need that rule. They just won't do that thing, right? So I think there is a place to say if the government or whoever is going to sort of sweeten the pot by telling an organization, hey, if you give to this a charity, you can write it off in your taxes. Great, right? But the truly righteous person will give even if they can't write it off on their taxes. They shouldn't have to have that motivation, right? They're going to do what's good anyway. And I think that's part of what's going on here is Jesus saying, yeah, listen, if you personally, I mean, he isn't saying don't be motivated by reward. Because look at look at the theme. It's constantly, do this for the right reasons and God will reward you. It isn't like saying I can't be interested at all. Right? Go ahead.
Well, we also judge not that you
yeah, right.
What difference does it make what we think of it? Mm-hmm. The kids got to see the plays.
Yep.
The donors gave for a variety of reasons, maybe because you wrote a really good thing.
I always wrote it.
Good. Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Well, and that's right. And I think the words here are important. The very way it's given to us, right? It isn't being presented in a way where we're saying, why is that other person doing this thing? It's not asking us to examine other people's intentions. It's asking us to examine our own, right? Jesus is saying, like, why? I mean, he's basically asking you, when you give to the poor, why are you doing that? If you're doing it because, I mean, again, we need to put us in his world. This is why I brought up the story of the widow's mite. Like, in this setting in the synagogue, it was actually set up so that when you went and put coins in the place you put them, it made a noise. So if you put in a whole lot of coins, it made a whole lot of noise, and everybody knew, oh, look, Katie gave tons of money to today, right? Everybody go tell her how awesome she is, right? Whereas this widow put in 2 pennies, which is like, well, that's worthless, right? But Jesus' point is actually she's the one who gave the most because she gave everything that she had, whereas everyone else was just giving out of their abundance. Right now, I think we need to be careful with that story because you also get people who are like, I'll give what I have to the church and then everyone will bless me, right? That's also not what's being said. Go ahead, Dale.
When you were saying that the righteous person will do it whether there's a law there or not, it made me think about conscience. We've been doing a lot of reading and watching things about Hitler and the Nazis and the concentration camps and stuff. And you'll always encounter somebody who resists what is expected, the conformity to the brutality and the stuff that's going on. Is it conscience, and what is the role of conscience for a Christian? Is a Christian and conscience is that hearing God's voice, or is conscience something different?
I don't think I can answer that question, and I definitely can't even sort of qualify it in 20 minutes. But what I will say is, like, I think it's a combination of, one, we do think that God is speaking to us internally, right? So is conscience the Holy Spirit in us, which we can, of course, go like this too, internally too, right? I think that's part of it. Part of it is also God is continually transforming us into people who are this on our own, right? So again, the idea is a righteous person just does what is good. They don't need the rule, right? This kind of comes from moral philosophy and theology, but a perfectly moral person does not need to deliberate over what's right and wrong. They just know. They don't even think about it. They just do the right thing, right? And none of us are there. Right? Hold on, Sally was first.
Okay.
The normal person who's still
Yeah.
You made a good point about conscience. Many times, I'm sure all of you have done something more like a reaction. Maybe something just hit your heart and you gave, or you did something.
Yeah.
Or the crowd said, do this, and you went and did it. It never went really through your brain. So when you examine yourself,
Yeah.
is there a way to learn from that? I did this today. Why did I do this? You might need to confess that first and then keep working on it. But also, you do something that was really good and later you're thinking about it. What made me think to do that?
Right. So I think there's that is definitely going on. I think this is what we're being pushed to do in this passage, is to actually say, look into your own heart and ask, why do you do the things that you do? So you're doing the right thing externally. We're now being asked, examine your hearts to figure out if you're really doing it for the right reasons. So we're advancing here in our moral education. We're kind of told what the right thing to do is. Now we're being asked, why are we doing it? Right? Hal, you had your question.
Well, I keep wondering, are we all born with the same moral compass and it points true north? And that it's our environment that winds up changing us to the extent that we're all over the map now? And some folks compass point a little northwest, some northeast, some... I
don't think we have an answer to the question if everybody's born with the same moral compass. I mean, some people might just be born worse than others. I think that's a possibility, right? I don't know. I do think our external environment definitely forms us, right? The other thing that's going on here, I think, is, and this is where we can begin thinking about how we're going to interact with other people. If part of what's important here is intentions, then I think it's also giving us a way of thinking about the way we interact with other people, especially those we strongly disagree with grace. So I'm going to go on a little bit of a limb, and Bob, you don't need to do anything. Bob and I talked about maybe turning the camera off, but I'm going to be vague. I've got some people in my life who strongly think differently than I do on some certain issues, right? And I would say their beliefs and actions are out of line with what Christians should do. And they're in turn saying, no, I'm wrong, right? Christians shouldn't think the things that you think, right? And I'll just give you the issue. The issue is homosexuality. Can you be a Christian and be gay or not? And they think very strongly, the Bible says, no. It's a sin. If you do it, you go to hell. I think they're wrong, right? But their intention is actually to be faithful to Scripture. Right? This is how they understand what the Bible says. They're trying to be faithful to that out of concern for others. They're wrong, I think. Right? But their reasons for it are actually good. Right? So then how do you handle that? Like, the temptation for me is to think your view is evil and despicable and sort of write you off. Right? Well, that's not going to change their mind. Right? The reason is to actually try to argue the issues, to say, what does the biblical text actually mean? How does this actually work in the world? I mean, to get into the issues and work our way through it, not to judge other people's intentions, right? This is the problem with our politics. We think the people who don't believe the way that we believe are evil.
Just wrong.
Right? And we should go to places that they're just wrong, right? And it's hard, like, and this, I think, gets into Hal's point about how the environment affects us, right? If you've been raised in a congregation or in a community that thinks a certain act is a sin, and you've been there for 40 or 50 years, that's deeply ingrained into you. And then when someone challenges it and says, no, you've been wrong, it's hard to change your mind, right? But telling them they're evil isn't going to help. That's not the way to handle it. Right, it's right, exactly. It's, right? And it's hard, right? And I think there's also wisdom to, sometimes maybe they just are evil. Often they aren't, but sometimes maybe they're, because look at what Jesus does. Sometimes he's really harsh with people. Most of the time he's gentle. But he seems to know when someone is acting not out of good intentions. And when they are, but they're just wrong, right? So he's gentle with them when they're just wrong. He's pretty harsh when they aren't. Right? Right, exactly, right? I mean, there are times when he says, "Well, we need a direct action here," right? We're not going to argue it out. But most of the time, he has a nice conversation and tries to change their mind kindly.
Well, you realize you can't change their mind. You dust off.
Right. That's the other issue, right? But I think even there, right, the issue is it isn't just that they're unwilling to change their mind. It's that, well, actually, that's the way to put it. It isn't that they aren't willing to hear an argument. It's that they are just not going to change their mind no matter what you say. That's when you clean your sandals off, right? If there's still the opportunity to keep talking, you stay.
Well, let me bring up an issue that's not homosexuality. Just so you know, I agree with you.
This
one's a little closer to home for you. I used to think that women should not be ordained. And I had been raised in a very conservative, and all the pastors I knew were men, and it was just obvious women can't teach. You know, except for those Quakers. These Quaker women. And then we went to a church back in New York, and the associate pastor was a woman. And when she preached, it was powerful. And I said, why God? Why God is this woman preaching powerful messages?
Why waste the power on a woman, right?
And it wasn't that I was convinced by an argument. I was convinced by the power of God saying, look at what I'm doing with this person.
Well, and that's often how it happens, right? Whether it's, by the way, I grew up thinking women shouldn't be pastors. That's the kind of church I grew up in, and it was a combination of seeing women who were really awesome preachers, one, right? And then two, actually being exposed to different ways of interpreting certain biblical passages to say, oh, that's not what it means. And actually, if you read it in its historical context, which is what I'm trying to do with you all the time, right? It actually comes out much differently, right? And it isn't saying what we think it says, right? So it's a combination of education and then just experience, right? And what I think this is the issue, is people are actually changed more by the experience part, the argument comes afterwards, than by the argument first, right? Which, again, like the homosexual issue, right? More people's minds are changed because they actually come to know someone who's homosexual than by the other possible arguments of the Bible, right? But we still need to do both things. We need the argument side too, right? Because we can also get into situations where our experience leads us in a certain way that still isn't necessarily right? But I think this is the issue here of, again, it's examining our hearts. Why are we doing the things that we're doing? So you can have people who actually do the wrong thing for the right reasons. Right? And you have people who do the right thing for the wrong reasons. And what we seem to be being pushed to here is it would actually be better to do the wrong thing for the right reasons.
Better.
Yeah.
Got it.
Right?
Okay.
Killing Hitler.
Well, right. I mean, it's like, on that example, I mean, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of the people that actually tried to kill Hitler. He actually said, what I'm doing is a sin. Killing another human being is a sin. But not doing it is worse. Right, here in this case. Right. And again, we can argue about those kinds of things. Right? Let's look quickly at each of the things, or at least one of them. We'll do the first one, almsgiving. So I think this one comes first in Jesus' list here because it's the hardest one. You ask any pastor what they don't want to preach about, and they will say money. Because no one wants to give up their money, and no one wants to ask people to give up their money, right? Money. I guess that's the point, right? Is he talks about money way more than he talks about, let's say, sex or all the other things that get people fired up, right? This is the thing he really comes down to. And again, why? Because it is a place where if this is really about your intentions, right, what you do with your money will clearly indicate that, right? It's just a will, right? So I think it's really clear here. The problem is not whether or how you're going to give alms. It's what your intention behind it is doing, right? So his example here, he talks about hypocrites constantly. The people in the background there are the scribes and the Pharisees. So, right? So what he's saying is, why do they do things like tithe? They're doing it to draw attention to themselves. They're doing it to say, look, we obey the law perfectly. We are righteous. Jesus is saying it's...
They want to be a good example.
Well, so there's an element of that. Or we could also say we're being a good example. But Jesus is saying here, he's convinced, and I think we should agree he's right, that the people doing this thing, right, are doing it for reasons that are to draw attention to themselves. He's telling us that's why they're doing it, right? He knows, right? I think we should be careful because we don't have the insight he has always, right? But he is saying, again, he's asking us to do it for ourselves. Like, why are you doing this, right? And what does he end up saying? His exhortation is, don't even let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, right? I mean, this should be so in private that you forget about it as soon as you've done it. And the one way to think of this is, love is self-forgetting. What I mean by that is it doesn't think of its a self. That's actually pretty much said in that way in the Bible all the time, right? It acts for the sake of the other, for the beloved, right? So if God has told me to give alms, I should do it, right? But I'm not doing it in order for God to be happy with me, because he already is happy with me, right? I don't have to earn it. I'm not doing it to earn the praise of others. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, right? Even more so, I'm doing it because I love God. This is an example I like to use all the time of, think about the people in your lives that you really love, your spouse, your kids. You begin to take an interest in the things that they're interested in. So I could embarrass my daughter. She now hates these things, but she was about in kindergarten and first grade. She loved My Little Pony. And there was a point where I could tell you every character in My Little Pony, tell you what their power was, right? Because she cared about it, I cared about it, right? That's what we do when we love someone else. So if we love God, we will care about the things God cares about, right? Our problem is we love God and we love ourselves too, and we get it, which is okay to love yourself, but sometimes we get the order wrong, right? Right, and so we're supposed to do it because it's the right thing, and not because we're going to get patted on the back for doing it.
Most
Right.
important thing that you've said today is God is already happy with us.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to, we're not doing these things to get right with God. We already are. Right?
But yet, a lot of people keep trying.
Right. And again, I think this is part of the problem is we're not, I mean, again, yes, we're going to get a reward. So we're told that we're going to get rewarded for this, but that's not the motivation for doing it. The motivation is we love God because he loves us. Let's go do it, right? And who cares if anybody sees? Dale.
Well, when you were talking about giving alms, I was reminded of Matthew 23 where he's chewing out the Pharisees. And it struck me as I was just skimming down through that. He talks about alms, he talks about prayer. It's like the flip side.
So turn your handout over. Point 5. Well, good. I mean, this is you anticipated. Like that's exactly right. Like this whole theme is so important to whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew that the same thing comes up again in chapter 23. Same terms, same arguments, all of it. Right? It's like it's flipped on its head. Right? But these same themes keep coming up. Right? Exactly, it must be very important, right? The last thing I want to say, and then we'll end, is actually my point 6, Roman numeral 6 on the back. So I think this is where we have to, this is kind of a principle of how do we interpret the Bible. If you go back just a chapter, not even half a chapter earlier, to chapter 5, verse 16, we read, "Let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven," right? So here it says, do it so people can see. Whereas here we're reading, don't do it so people can see. So which one is it? Right? I mean, it's literally like 15 verses apart. It's not like it's hundreds of pages apart, right?
But the last part.
Right, exactly, right. I mean, you're doing it for the sake of, so here we do have people saying, we're doing it to be a good example, and I think it's even, what it even more so is, it's actually evangelistic. Come look at the kind of people we are. Don't you want to be part of this? Right? But what's the difference, right? I think, and I'm actually just quoting to someone else here. Chapter 5 is speaking of doing good deeds generally, and the goal is to lead people to praise God. While what we're reading about here in chapter 6 is the obligations we're all supposed to do. We're all supposed to do these things, right? But again, we're supposed to do them to give God a glory, not ourselves, right? And that's the issue, right? Is again, it's about intentions. What are your reasons for doing what you're doing? Those are just as important, if not more so, than what you actually do. Right? So I think one thing that it does, it actually says that the righteousness should be determined not by what you do, but by the reasons for which you're doing it. Right? So we can actually have good, righteous people who do the wrong thing. Right? That's what's hard about this. Right? But this is what Jesus is asking. He's asking, like, examine your own heart. What are you doing? Right? Get that righteousness is you're right with God. And that's established on the point Katie keeps coming back to of God is the one who makes us right with him, not us. We already are if you're here and you care about this, you're already righteous. Right? Now, live like it. right? Go ahead, Kathy.
Because one of the biggest criticisms of people who don't attend church, I think, from what I've heard occasionally sometimes, is that a lot of people in the church give a lot, do a do a lot, okay, like the
Yeah.
outside the building.
Yep.
So then you look at all this stuff, which way is the right way?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think the biggest, a lot of my professional life is involved with the fact that the church is in rapid decline. What are we going to do about that, right? And if you ask me why, the biggest reason is Christians don't live like Christians. Right, absolutely.
So the people you're talking with should feel welcome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Right.
that goes along with we're all sinners.
Right. But that is part of the issue, right? And this is what Jesus is saying here. It's like, don't just do these things for a show, right? Because people are going to see through it, right? That's enough for today.
I think the biggest advantage to going to church is the learning.
Yeah. Well, and the formation that happens, it isn't just the intellectual knowledge either. It's the whole package of being formed and shaped by other people as well, right?